Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel back to the ancient world, to a time when gods walked among men, when kings ruled from palaces of stone and cedar, and when the fate of entire cities could rest on the pride of a single person. We are going back 3,000 years, to the shores of a great sea, to a city that sat on a hill above the water, proud and quiet, watching the world pass beneath it. This is the story of Troy, of the people who lived inside its pale stone walls, of the armies that crossed the sea and waited in the dust outside, of the heroes who fought and fell and were remembered, and of the long, strange night that ended everything. It is a story that has been told for thousands of years, and it is still being told because it touches something deep and true about what it means to be human, about love and pride and grief and the quiet cost of war. It is also a story made for the night, for slow voices and half-open eyes, for the moment when the day has finally finished with you and you are ready to let something older take over. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. Let the ancient world come to you. Let us begin. There was a city on a hill above the sea. It had stood there for a very long time, long before the war, long before the ships, long before the world knew its name. The city was called Troy, and the sea below it, in those ancient days, was still and very dark at night. The wind moved slowly across the water, carrying the smell of salt and distance, and the stars above were cold and far away. The city rested on its hill in the darkness, quiet and proud, as it had always been. Troy sat at the edge of two worlds. To the west lay the great Aegean Sea, wide and restless, always moving, always carrying something from one shore to another. To the east stretched the open lands of Asia, dry and vast and ancient, full of roads that went on longer than most men had ever walked. Every ship that passed between those two worlds had to sail beneath Troy. Every merchant vessel, heavy with grain or oil or cloth, every warship cutting through the dark water, every small fishing boat moving slowly along the coast, they all passed beneath those pale stone walls, and the city watched them come and go, as it had watched for generations, growing rich and quiet and sure of itself. The walls of Troy were famous. Even then, they were built of heavy stone, fitted together with great care and great patience, and they rose high above the hill, so that anyone approaching from the sea could see them long before they could see anything else. The stones were pale, almost white in strong sunlight, and in the early morning they caught the first light of the sun and seemed to glow softly, like something sleeping. People said that gods had helped to build those walls, that the stones had been set in place by hands that were not entirely human. Whether that was true or not, no one alive could say. But the walls were strong, and Troy felt safe behind them, and that feeling had lasted for so long that most people inside the city had stopped thinking about it at all. The city itself was everything that a city in those days could be. Its streets were narrow and worn smooth by many years of feet, moving back and forth between the same places, the market and the well, and the gates, and the high palace on the summit of the hill. The houses were close together, built of stone and plaster, with flat roofs and small windows that let in the breeze in summer and kept out the cold in winter. In the mornings, the markets filled with sound, the voices of sellers and buyers, the clatter of pottery and the smell of bread baking and oil warming in the sun. Children ran between the legs of adults. Without being noticed, old women sat in doorways, watching the street with the calm attention of people who have seen enough to know that most things pass in time. At the center of all of it stood the palace of the king. It was larger than anything else in the city, and older too, with thick walls and long corridors, and rooms that smelled of cedar and smoke. There were storerooms deep in the lower floors, full of grain and oil and wine, enough to feed the city for months. If the gates ever had to be closed, there were halls where the king sat with his advisors and his sons, talking through the long evenings about trade and alliances and the movements of other kingdoms. And there were private rooms, quieter and higher up, where the women of the palace lived and worked and watched the sea from narrow windows. The king of Troy was an old man named Priam. He had ruled the city for many years, longer than most people in the city could remember, and in that time he had watched Troy grow richer and more powerful and more sure of its place in the world. He was not a young man anymore. His hair was white, and his hands were slow when he lifted them, and sometimes he sat for long moments without speaking, watching something that no one else in the room could see, but his eyes were still sharp, and his voice when he spoke was still steady, and the people of the city trusted him in the way that people trust a thing that has always been there, the way they trust the walls and the hills and the sea. Priam had many sons, more sons than most men are given, more sons than he could sometimes remember. At once, they filled the palace and the training grounds and the streets of the city with noise and movement. Young men always coming and going, always arguing and competing, and doing the things that young men do. The oldest and the greatest of them was a man named Hector. Hector was everything that a king's son was supposed to be, and in some ways more than that. He was tall, with a steadiness about him that made people feel calmer just by being near him. He moved through the city with the unhurried certainty of someone who belonged to it completely, and when he looked at you, you felt that he was actually looking at you, not through you or past you, at something more important. He was a warrior of great skill, trained since childhood in the arts of combat, and he wore that training the way other men wear old clothes, without thinking about it, without needing to display it. The soldiers of Troy followed him, not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. And there is a difference between those two things that makes all the difference in the world. The people of Troy loved Hector in the quiet way that people love the things that protect them. When he walked through the gates after a long day, old men nodded from their doorways. Children stopped their games to watch him pass. Women called quiet greetings from the upper windows. He did not wave or make speeches or play the role of the great hero. He simply walked home, and the city felt safer for it. Priam had another son as well, younger than Hector, and very different. His name was Paris, and where Hector was steady, Paris was bright. Where Hector had been shaped by discipline and duty, Paris had grown up in comfort and ease, and the warm approval of everyone around him. He was beautiful in the way that certain mornings are beautiful, warm and clear, and a little careless about the effect they have on the people who see them. He had spent his youth in the palace, learning music and poetry and the arts of pleasure, and he had never gone particularly hungry or cold or afraid. He was well liked, and he knew it, and that knowledge sat on him lightly, the way silk sits on a person who has never worn anything else. Troy, in those years before the war, was a city of sound and smell and slow ordinary days. You could hear the looms working in the upper rooms of the houses, the steady rhythm of the shuttle passing back and forth, back and forth. You could hear the animals in the lower streets, the soft complaint of oxen and the sharp voices of goats. At the harbor below the walls, you could hear the creak of ropes and the knock of wooden hulls against the stone piers, and the conversations of sailors who had come from far away and were talking about everything they had seen. And at night, when the city grew quiet and the last fires were burning low, you could hear the sea. It was a low sound, distant and steady, like breathing, like something very large, resting at the edge of the world. The people of Troy had lived beside that sound all their lives. Most of them no longer heard it in any conscious way. It was simply there, beneath everything, beneath the markets and the palace and the prayers and the everyday noise of a city going about its business. The sea was always there, and it was always dark, and somewhere far across it, in a direction most people in Troy had never thought much about, the rest of the world was moving. Kings were gathering in those years before the war. Ships were being built in harbors far to the west, in places with names like Mycenae and Sparta and Argos and Ithaca. Men were sharpening their weapons and counting their soldiers and making promises to each other that would bind them together for years. Troy did not know this yet. On a quiet evening, the city looked as it had always looked. Smoke rose from the cook fires, lamps burned low in the windows. The gates were closed for the night, and the guards walked their slow paths along the top of the walls, and everything felt permanent. But stillness, sometimes, is only the moment before something shifts, and in the courts of the gods, high above the human world, something had already shifted. A choice had already been made by a young man who did not yet understand what he had chosen. A golden apple had already been thrown, and the name of a woman had already been spoken aloud in a place where names have consequences. Her name was Helen. She lived far away, across the dark water, in a palace of her own, and she was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, let the city rest. Let Priam sit in his hall in the long evening, surrounded by the sound of his sons talking. Let Hector stand on the walls for a moment before he goes inside, looking out at the sea, feeling the night wind on his face. Let Paris close his eyes in his soft bed, easy and unbothered, the way only the young and the lucky sleep. Let the sea move slowly below the hill, and let the stars turn above the city, cold and indifferent and very old. Troy is still standing. The war has not yet come, and the night is very long. Every great story has a beginning, and sometimes that beginning is so small, so seemingly trivial, that it is almost impossible to believe it led to what came after. The war that would destroy Troy and reshape the ancient world did not begin with soldiers or politics or a clash of armies. It began with a wedding and an argument and a golden apple and a choice made by a young man on a quiet hillside who had no idea what he was doing. The wedding was held on the slopes of Mount Pelion, and it was attended by gods as well as humans, which was unusual and should perhaps have been a warning. The gods of the ancient world were not always kind guests. They brought gifts that cut both ways, blessings that carried hidden costs, and they had a long memory for slights. One goddess was not invited to the wedding, a goddess named Eris, whose name means discord, and who was not the kind of person you wanted to insult. She arrived anyway, uninvited and quietly furious, and she threw a golden apple into the gathering with a single inscription carved into its surface. The apple said, "For the most beautiful." 3 goddesses reached for it at the same moment. Hera, who was the queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage and power. Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom and craft and war. And Aphrodite, who was the goddess of love and desire and the complicated feeling that makes people do things they later cannot explain. All 3 claimed the apple. None of them would let it go. And the argument that followed was the kind of argument that only very powerful people can have, enormous and proud and completely without resolution. In the end, it was decided that a mortal man would judge between them, not a king or a hero or a great warrior, but an ordinary man, or at least a man who was believed to be ordinary, a shepherd living quietly on the slopes of Mount Ida near the great city of Troy. His name was Paris. He was, in fact, the son of King Priam, though neither he nor anyone else knew it at the time, for he had been given away at birth, following a prophecy that said he would one day bring destruction to his city. He had been sent out of Troy as an infant and raised by shepherds on the mountain, and he had grown up beautiful and easy, and largely untroubled by the weight of destiny. Each of the 3 goddesses came to Paris in turn on that quiet hillside above the valley, and each one offered him something in exchange for his judgment. Hera offered him power, dominion over kingdoms, the ability to rule wherever he looked. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in battle, the kind of ability that made great warriors into legends. And Aphrodite, who was always the most direct, offered him love. Specifically, she offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, a woman named Helen, who was at that moment the queen of Sparta and the wife of a king named Menelaus. Paris chose Aphrodite. He chose love, or perhaps more accurately, he chose desire, and he chose it without thinking very carefully about what the choice would cost or who else would pay the price of it. He was young and beautiful, and he had lived all his life on a peaceful hillside without anything particularly serious happening to him. He did not think in the long, careful way that consequences require. He simply chose the thing that appealed to him most in the moment, and then the moment was over, and the choice was made, and nothing in the world could unmake it. Shortly after this, Paris discovered who he was. He returned to Troy, was recognized by his family, and was welcomed back into the palace with celebration and relief. He was Priam's son, a prince of Troy, and the city opened itself to him with all the warmth that a long-lost child receives. He had fine clothes and a fine room and everything that a prince could want. And then Aphrodite, who kept her promises, arranged for him to travel to Sparta, where he would be the guest of King Menelaus, and where he would meet Helen. Sparta was a city very different from Troy. It was harder and colder, and less given to the pleasures of music and poetry and comfortable living. The Spartans were a warrior people, proud of their toughness, suspicious of softness in all its forms. Menelaus was their king, a large and serious man who had earned his throne through the respect of hard men and who kept it through the same quality. He was not a particularly bad man, and he was not a cruel husband. He was simply a king, with a king's concerns and a king's assumption that the things belonging to him would remain where he had placed them. Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world. This was not simply a compliment. It was almost a fact, a recognized truth that had shaped her entire life. She had been fought over since she was a child, when so many men wanted to marry her that her father had made them all swear an oath to support whoever she chose and to defend that choice against anyone who tried to overturn it. The oath had seemed like a formality at the time, an elaborate way of managing the jealousy of powerful men. No one thought much about it. Helen married Menelaus, and they had a daughter, and life in Sparta went on in its usual way, serious and orderly and a little austere. And then Paris arrived. What exactly happened between Paris and Helen is something that the ancient world argued about for centuries and never quite agreed on. Some said Helen fell in love with Paris the moment she saw him, that Aphrodite's influence was so powerful that she had no choice in the matter, that she followed him willingly and even joyfully when he sailed back to Troy. Others said she was taken by force, that Paris was a thief and a betrayer of hospitality, that Helen wept all the way across the Aegean Sea and never stopped wanting to go home. The truth, as it usually is, was probably somewhere in between and more complicated than either version, and tinged with the kind of feeling that does not translate cleanly into words. What is certain is this: when Menelaus returned from a journey and found his palace empty and his wife gone and his guest vanished with her, he was furious. He was a proud man and a powerful one, and what had happened to him was a humiliation in front of the entire Greek world. He went immediately to his brother, a man named Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in all of Greece, and he asked for help. Agamemnon agreed, partly out of loyalty to his brother, and partly because he was the kind of man who had never needed much encouragement to go to war. The oath that Helen's father had made all her suitors swear now came back to life after years of sleeping. Every king who had once competed for Helen was bound by his own promise to defend her marriage, and Menelaus went to each of them in turn, and each of them, some more willingly than others, said yes. Armies began to gather, ships were pulled down to the water, provisions were loaded, and weapons sharpened, and soldiers said goodbye to their families, not knowing if they would ever say hello again. The war had not yet started, but the apple had been thrown, and the choice had been made, and the gods were watching with the patient interest of beings who have all the time in the world. In Troy, Paris returned with Helen. He brought her into the city, and she was seen by the people and the old men who sat at the city gates, and even they, old as they were and cautious as they had learned to be, said quietly among themselves that it was not surprising that for such a woman, a man might understand why a war was coming, even if he could not approve of it. Helen herself stood in the palace and looked out from the high windows at the sea. The sea was the same sea she had crossed to get here. It was darker now, as evening came, and there was nothing on it except the last light of the sun, lying flat on the water. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know how many men would die for her, or how long the waiting would be, or what the end would look like. She only knew she was here, in a city that smelled of cedar and salt wind, far from everything she had always known. And somewhere to the west, across that dark water, the ships were already being built. There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath before it changes. The years after Paris brought Helen to Troy were like that. The city went on as it always had. The markets and the prayers, and the long evenings in the palace. But underneath everything, there was a new feeling, a quietness that was not quite peace, a stillness that was not quite calm. Word had come of armies gathering in the west. Word had come of ships being built in harbors that had never seen so many keels at once. The people of Troy did not know exactly what was coming or when it would arrive, but they could feel it the way you can sometimes feel a change in the weather before the sky has given anything away. The Greek world that assembled against Troy was not a single nation. It was a collection of kingdoms and islands and city-states, each with its own king and its own army and its own reasons for fighting, bound together by the old oath and by the leadership of Agamemnon. Agamemnon was a large man with large ambitions and the kind of authority that comes from being the most powerful person in a room for so long that no one can quite remember a time before it. He was not beloved exactly, but he was respected, and sometimes in a time of war, those two things are the same. Among the kings who answered the call, some were more remarkable than others. There was Odysseus, the king of the small island of Ithaca, a man who was not particularly large or particularly fierce, but who was exceptionally clever in the way that very few people manage to be. Clever in a way that went all the way down, that touched everything he did and said and thought. He had not wanted to go to war. He had a wife named Penelope, whom he loved, and a son named Telemachus, who was still very small, and he had tried to avoid the call by pretending to be mad, plowing his fields with salt instead of seed. But someone had seen through the pretense, and now he was going, and he brought with him a mind that would prove more useful than any sword before the war was done. There was Diomedes, a warrior of great courage and skill, one of those men who seem to have been born without the particular kind of fear that stops other men from walking into dangerous places. There was Ajax, enormous and steady, a man who fought like a wall, immovable and reliable, and almost impossible to push back. There was Nestor, the oldest of all the Greek kings, so old that he could remember things that had happened before most of the others were born, and who talked about those things at length and with great pleasure, though the younger men sometimes found it difficult to listen for as long as he wished. And there was Achilles. Achilles was the greatest warrior of his age, perhaps the greatest warrior the world had ever seen, and everyone knew it, including Achilles himself, which was part of what made him so difficult. He was young, with the kind of beauty that belongs to people who have not yet been touched by time or failure, and he burned with an intensity that made the air around him feel different, charged with something that was not quite human. He had been raised by a centaur, trained in the arts of war and music and healing, dipped as an infant in the river Styx by his mother, a sea goddess named Thetis, who had wanted to make him immortal, who had wanted to keep death away from her beloved son. She had held him by the heel when she dipped him in the water, and that heel remained the one place where death could find him. He did not think much about that. He thought mostly about glory, about the kind of fame that outlasts death, about being remembered. He had been told that he would have a choice, a long life in peace, ordinary and forgotten, or a short life of war, brilliant and eternal. He had not had to think about it for very long. There was one more man whose story was complicated in ways that would matter later. His name was Patroclus, and he was Achilles' closest companion, his dearest friend, the person in the world who understood him best and who Achilles, in his own way, loved most completely. Patroclus was different from Achilles in almost every way. He was gentler, more patient, more given to thinking about other people's pain. He tempered Achilles the way water tempers fire, not putting it out, but giving it a form that could be used without burning everything it touched. Where Achilles was magnificent and dangerous, Patroclus was human and kind, and the two of them together made something more complete than either would have been alone. The fleet that assembled at the port of Aulis was the largest collection of ships the ancient world had ever seen, more than 1,000 vessels, by most accounts, each carrying soldiers and supplies, and weapons, and the weight of individual human hope and fear. The beach at Aulis was crowded with men from every corner of the Greek world, speaking different dialects, worshiping the same gods in slightly different ways, eating different food. They had come for different reasons, some for honor, some for adventure, some because they had sworn an oath and had no choice, some because Agamemnon's power was such that refusing him was not really an option. A few had come because they genuinely believed it was right, that what Paris had done was wrong, and that wrong things should be answered for. The winds refused to blow. That was the first sign that this war would not be simple. The fleet sat at Aulis for days, and then weeks, unable to move. The sails hanging slack, the sea calm and unhelpful. The soothsayers were consulted, and the answer they gave was terrible. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon, and she had stilled the winds. The only way to restore them, to get the fleet moving, was for Agamemnon to sacrifice his daughter, a young woman named Iphigenia. This is one of the darkest moments in the whole long story, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment. Agamemnon sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, that Iphigenia was to be married to Achilles, and Clytemnestra brought their daughter to Aulis happily, thinking it was a celebration. What happened when they arrived was not a celebration. What happened was a sacrifice, and Agamemnon watched it happen, and the winds came back, and the fleet sailed. But Clytemnestra did not forget. In the years that followed, while her husband was away at war, she did not forget, and the remembering would have consequences that stretched far beyond Troy. The fleet crossed the Aegean Sea in a great slow movement, 1,000 ships spreading across the water in the morning light, shields and spearheads catching the sun. Below the cliffs of the Trojan coast, the ships came ashore, the keels grinding on the beach, the soldiers jumping down into the shallow water and wading in with their weapons held high. Troy watched from the walls. The city had been warned, had prepared itself as best it could. The gates were shut, the walls were manned. The old men sat in their places and watched the sea fill up with ships, and tried to believe that what they were seeing was not as bad as it looked. It was exactly as bad as it looked. The two worlds faced each other across a narrow strip of ground. The city on its hill with its pale walls and its long history, and the camp on the beach with its fires and its noise, and its 1,000 ships pulled up in rows along the shore. Between them was the plain of Troy, a flat expanse of dusty ground where the river Scamander ran toward the sea, where the grasses moved in the wind from the water where in the years to come an enormous number of men would die. But that was all still ahead. On the first night, the camp was alive with fires, and the men were loud and restless and not yet afraid. They did not know yet how long they would be there. Most of them thought it would be quick. It would not be quick. Time moves differently in a siege. The days are not marked by movement or discovery or change. They are marked by the same things, happening again and again. The morning watch, the midday heat, the afternoon raids on the plain, the retreat at evening, the long night, and then morning again. The Greeks had come expecting a quick war and found themselves in a very slow one. They could not breach the walls of Troy. Troy could not drive them away from the beach, and so the two sides settled into the strange rhythm of a siege that would go on for 10 years. The camp on the beach grew into something almost like a city in its own right. The men built shelters and storage huts and cooking areas, and in the spaces between the ships, they set up the routines of a long absence. There were arguments over supplies, over status, over the spoils from raiding expeditions to the towns and villages in the countryside around Troy. There were friendships formed in the tedium and rivalries that festered in the same tedium, and homesickness that settled into men the way cold settles into stone, slowly and deeply, and in places you cannot easily reach. The Greeks did not only fight the Trojans, they raided the towns of the surrounding region, taking cattle and grain and slaves, bringing back whatever they could find to supplement the supply lines that ran back across the Aegean. These raids were often led by Achilles, who was restless in a way that sitting behind camp walls could not accommodate. He needed movement, needed the sharp clarity that came with fighting, and he went out onto the plain and into the countryside with an energy that made other men step aside and watch. It was on one of these raids that the argument that would nearly lose the Greeks the entire war had its beginning. A priest of Apollo named Chryses had a daughter who was captured in one of the raids and given as a prize to Agamemnon. The priest came to the camp to ransom her, to offer gifts in exchange for his child, and Agamemnon sent him away with harsh words. Apollo heard his priest's prayer, and Apollo was not forgiving to people who insulted those who served him. A plague came down on the Greek camp, carried in the gods' silver arrows, and men began to die of it in numbers that the fighting had not yet achieved. The Greeks consulted a prophet who told them what they already feared. Agamemnon had to return the priest's daughter without ransom, without anything in exchange, and only then would the plague end. Agamemnon agreed, but he made clear that he expected compensation, and he took Achilles' own prize, a woman named Briseis, to replace what he had lost. This was not just a practical matter, it was a question of honor, of status, of the kind of respect that warriors in that world measured everything by, including their own reason for being there. Achilles was furious. He was furious in the deep, consuming way that he did everything without moderation, without the kind of calculation that might have led a more cautious man to swallow his anger and wait for a better moment. He withdrew from the fighting entirely. He sat in his tent on the beach, and he refused to go out. And he took with him the most formidable fighting force the Greeks had. Without Achilles and his Myrmidons, the Greek army was diminished in a way that everyone could feel. For a time the war went on without him. There were days of fighting on the plain that felt enormous and consequential. Great warriors on both sides meeting in single combat, While the armies watched, dust rising in the afternoon heat, the sound of bronze on bronze, and the cries of the wounded, Hector fought, and fought magnificently, moving through the battle with the quiet assurance of a man who is in the right place, doing the right thing. He was not the fastest or the most spectacular fighter, but he was the most reliable, and reliability in war is worth more than it is sometimes given credit for. The Trojans held their own, better than held their own. In the years that followed Achilles' withdrawal, there were periods when they pushed the Greeks back toward the ships, when it seemed possible that they might actually win, might actually drive these invaders back into the sea and reclaim the plain outside their walls. Old Priam watched from the walls and felt something he had not felt since the ships first appeared. A small, careful hope. Inside the city, life went on in the way that life must go on, even in the middle of a war, because the alternative is to stop. Children were born in Troy during the siege. People got married. Old people died of the things old people die of, quietly and in bed, not on the plain outside. The markets were quieter, the supplies more carefully rationed, the expressions on people's faces more guarded than they used to be. But the city was still alive. The fire still burned in the evenings. The women still worked at their looms in the upper rooms, and the sound of it was steady and familiar, the closest thing to peace that was available. Hector had a wife named Andromache and a small son named Astyanax. And in the midst of everything else happening in the world, this small family was real and particular and deeply felt. Andromache knew what war was. She had already lost her father and her brothers to Greek spears, had watched her whole family reduced to nothing, and she understood in her body what Hector's life on the plain cost and could cost. She asked him to stay closer to the walls, to let the other men fight in the open ground, to not be so willing with his own life. He listened to her, and he explained why he could not do what she asked, and the scene between them is one of the most quietly devastating in the whole story, because they both knew she was right, and they both knew it did not matter. Hector lifted his small son, and the child was frightened by the horsehair crest on his father's helmet and began to cry, and Hector laughed and took the helmet off and held the baby and kissed him, and then handed him back to Andromache, and then he put the helmet back on and went back out to the war, because that was what he was, and there was nothing either of them could do about what he was. Helen, meanwhile, lived in Troy in a condition that was never quite what anyone had expected it to be. She was there, and she was Paris's, and in some ways, she was the cause of everything happening around her, and in other ways, she was simply a woman living in a strange city far from home, watching from the walls as men died for a situation she had not entirely chosen. The Trojans did not hate her, or at least most of them did not hate her openly. They knew what she had cost them, but they also looked at her and understood, with a kind of resigned human wisdom, why a man might have made such a choice. She was that beautiful. It did not make it better. It did not make it worse. It simply was. The years passed, 10 of them, slow and heavy. The siege settled into the landscape like a stone in a riverbed, something that had always been there and could not be imagined not being there. The men who had come as young soldiers had grown older on that beach. Some of them had died and been buried in the foreign soil of the Troad. Some had been wounded and healed and wounded again. Some had gone quietly mad in the way that long waiting can drive men mad, and were not quite the same as they had been when they arrived. And Achilles sat in his tent, and the war went on without him, and everything was about to change. Patroclus watched Achilles sit in his tent, and he watched the battle go badly, and he could not stand it. This was his nature. He was not the kind of man who could watch other people suffer and do nothing, who could hold himself apart from pain simply because it was easier. He saw the Greeks pushed back toward the ships, saw the wounded men being carried past, heard the noise of a battle going wrong, and something in him rose up against the stillness of inaction. He went to Achilles. He did not ask him to fight. He knew better than that, knew that the pride which kept Achilles in his tent was not the kind of thing that could be argued away with words. Instead, he asked for something else. He asked for Achilles' armor. If he wore the armor, the Trojans would think it was Achilles come back to the fight. The sight of that armor, those particular greaves, and that particular shield and that particular helmet would frighten them. It might turn the battle. It might give the Greeks the breathing room they needed to stabilize their line. Achilles agreed. Though he had conditions, Patroclus could drive the Trojans back, but he was not to pursue them too far, not to let success carry him all the way to the walls of Troy, where the fighting was most dangerous, and where the gods themselves sometimes walked among the combatants. He was to do what was needed and then come back. Patroclus went out in Achilles' armor, and the plan worked. In the beginning, the Trojans saw the bronze, and the crest, and the particular way the figure moved, and the rumor ran through their lines like water through dry ground. Achilles is back. The Greek line steadied. The Trojan advance slowed. Men who had been pressing forward moments before began to look over their shoulders. But Patroclus was not Achilles. He was brave, genuinely brave. But he did not have Achilles' particular relationship with violence, the ease of it, the certainty, and he went too far. He was carried forward by the momentum of success, and then carried further by something harder to name, the desire to matter, to be more than a shadow, even in armor that was not his own. He drove toward the walls of Troy. He went where Achilles had told him not to go. Apollo was watching. The god who had sent the plague on the Greeks had never been friendly to them in this war, and he moved now against Patroclus with the focused attention that gods bring to human destruction when they have decided something must end. He knocked the helmet from Patroclus's head, snapped the spear in his hand, loosened the armor from his shoulders, and then Hector, the best fighter Troy had, found Patroclus standing exposed on the field and drove a spear through him. Patroclus fell. He died on the plain of Troy, in Achilles' borrowed armor, and the battle moved over him and around him, and for a long time the Greeks and the Trojans fought over his body, each side wanting possession of it for different reasons. The news came to Achilles in his tent. A messenger came running, and Achilles knew before the words were spoken, knew from the man's face and his speed and the quality of the silence that arrived with him. He listened to what was said. He sat very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that is the opposite of peace, the kind that is made of something enormous pressing in from all directions with no way out. And then he began to grieve, and his grief was like everything else about him, total, without limit, without the careful management that most people impose on their own sorrow to keep it from destroying them. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, came to him from the water and held him and listened to his pain, and she knew that this was the beginning of the end. that what came next could not be stopped. The Greeks built a great fire for Patroclus, and they mourned him with all the ceremony that warriors give to their dead. Achilles cut his hair and laid it on the body. He organized funeral games in Patroclus's honor, and the best men competed in them, as they competed in life, and the competitions were fierce and sometimes bitter. And through all of it, Achilles watched with eyes that had something changed in them, something that had not been there before. He needed new armor, because Hector had taken the old armor from Patroclus's body as his right. Thetis went to the forge of Hephaestus, the god of craft and fire, and commissioned a new set of armor for her son. Hephaestus worked through the night and made something extraordinary, a shield of layered bronze decorated with images of the entire world, cities at peace and cities at war, fields being plowed and harvested, the ocean running around the edge of everything, the stars turning above. It was the whole world hammered into metal, given to a man whose time in the world was nearly done. Achilles put on the new armor and came out of his tent, and the sun caught it, and the men who saw him stopped what they were doing and stared. He called an assembly, and he stood before the Greek army, and he ended his quarrel with Agamemnon, not warmly, not with forgiveness, but practically, because the quarrel no longer mattered next to what mattered, which was Hector. Agamemnon returned Briseis and offered gifts and made conciliatory speeches, and Achilles accepted what was necessary to accept. And then he put on his horses and his armor and went out onto the plain. The Trojans saw him coming, and they felt it before they could explain it, a change in the quality of the air, a new quality to the noise of the approaching army. The river god Scamander tried to drown Achilles in his own waters, frustrated by the volume of dead that Achilles was putting into him. The gods took sides and argued among themselves in ways that shook the earth, and Achilles moved through everything toward one person, one destination, one meeting that had been coming since the moment Patroclus fell. He was looking for Hector. Hector knew he was coming. He stood at the Scaean gate of Troy, and he did not retreat inside. Though everyone begged him to, his father begged him from the walls, his mother begged him, even the warrior's pride that had kept him on the field through 10 years of siege seemed to waver for a moment, just a moment, as he stood there alone and felt the size of what was coming toward him. And then something broke, and he ran. This is one of the strangest and most human moments in the whole story. Hector, who had never run from anyone, running away from Achilles. 3 times they circled the city walls, Achilles pursuing, Hector just ahead, the watching armies on both sides holding their breath, the gods above watching with the concentrated interest of beings who know how this ends. At last Hector stopped. He turned to face what was coming, and they fought. It did not last long, with Achilles in full possession of himself, with the armor of the gods on his back, and the grief and the fury of Patroclus's death burning in him like a clean fire. The outcome was not in doubt. Hector fell. He asked, dying, for his body to be returned to his family. Achilles did not promise it. The rage in him was still too large for that, still too fresh, still too much a part of who he was in that moment. What he did with Hector's body in the days that followed was one of the worst things in the story, one of the things that even the men who admired Achilles had difficulty looking at directly. He dragged it behind his chariot around the walls of Troy, morning after morning, in sight of the people on the walls, in sight of Hector's wife and his father and everyone who had loved him. He could not let go of his grief, and so he made his grief into punishment, and the punishment fell on people who had not been the ones to take Patroclus from him. Inside the city, Andromache heard the news, and the sound she made was the sound of a world ending. Old Priam stood on the walls and looked down at what was being done to his son, his finest son, the one who had been the heart of the city's defense, and something in him that had still been upright broke and stayed broken. There are moments in long stories when something shifts that cannot be shifted back. The death of Hector was one of those moments. Before it, the war had had a kind of balance. The city holding, the Greeks pressing, neither side able to deliver the final blow. Hector had been the weight on Troy's side of the scale, the thing that kept it from tipping over entirely. With him gone, Troy was still standing, and its walls were still intact, and the Trojan army was still in the field. But something essential had been removed from it, and everyone on both sides could feel the difference. Old King Priam did something extraordinary in the days after his son's death, something so unusual that the ancient world told the story of it for centuries afterward as an example of something rare and hard to name. He gathered a ransom, rich gifts, gold and cloth and precious things from the treasury of the city, and he loaded them onto a wagon, and at night, alone except for a single herald, he drove that wagon through the dark, out of the gates of Troy, across the plain that had been a battlefield for 10 years, and into the camp of his enemy. He went to Achilles. He went to the tent of the man who had killed his son and dragged his body in the dust. And he walked in, and he knelt before him, and he kissed his hands, the hands that had killed Hector. He looked up at Achilles with the eyes of a man who has nothing left to be afraid of, and he asked for his son's body. He reminded Achilles of his own father, far away in Greece, an old man who would never see his son again. And he said, "Think of him. Think of what it is to be a father who has lost what is most dear to him." Something in Achilles moved. Something shifted in the place where the great rage had been burning, and what came into that space was something quieter and more complicated and perhaps more human than anything else Achilles had felt since Patroclus died. He and Priam wept together in the tent on the beach, the old king and the young warrior, enemies, each the cause of the other's grief. And for a moment, the war fell away from both of them, and there was only the naked human fact of loss. Achilles returned Hector's body. He agreed to a truce of 12 days for the funeral rites, and Priam drove back through the night to Troy with his son's body on the wagon. And when they reached the gates, and the city saw what the old king had done, and what he had brought back, the sound of mourning that rose from Troy was something that could be heard across the plain and out to the ships. They mourned Hector for the 12 days of the truce. The women washed his body and wrapped it in fine cloth and spoke over it the formal words of lamentation that were the only gift the living could give the dead. Andromache held his hands and talked to him in the way that people talk to the dead, not because they expect an answer, but because the alternative is silence, and silence is too much. His mother cried over him. His father sat nearby and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the grief had not already said more completely. When the 12 days were over, the truce ended, and the war resumed, and the world moved on in the way that the world moves on, even from the worst things, because it cannot stop for the size of any individual grief, no matter how justified that grief might be. Achilles did not live long after this. His own death had been predicted, built into the choice he had made when he was young, and the gods had their own schedule that did not much care what any individual hero might prefer. He was killed by an arrow shot by Paris, guided by the god Apollo, who had never been on the Greek side in this war. The arrow found the one place on Achilles' body that was not protected, the heel by which his mother had held him when she tried to make him immortal. It found it because Apollo guided it there, because the gods' promises and the gods' grudges operate on a longer time frame than human life allows. Paris shooting the arrow that killed Achilles is one of the war's deepest ironies. Paris, who had started the whole thing, who was perhaps the least warlike person on either side of the conflict, who was better with a lyre than a spear, and who knew it, and was not particularly ashamed of the fact Paris's arrow brought down the greatest warrior who had ever lived. The ancient world found this uncomfortable, found it hard to square with the idea that heroism and excellence should be properly rewarded, that the greatest fighters should fall to other great fighters, rather than to an arrow shot by someone who had not really chosen to be at this war in the first place. But that is what happened, and Achilles fell, and the Greeks mourned him with a grief that matched what Troy had felt for Hector, because the two men were, in their way, reflections of each other, the best of their respective sides, the ones who had made the whole enormous, terrible enterprise feel, at its highest moments, like something worth remembering. Ajax and Odysseus fought over Achilles' armor when he died. Ajax, who was the larger and stronger man, and who had fought bravely through the whole war, believed the armor should come to him. Odysseus, who was smarter and more articulate, and who could make arguments that seemed to go right through your defenses, made a better case. The armor went to Odysseus. Ajax, who was not a complicated man and whose pride was genuine and enormous, could not accept this. He lost his mind in the way that the ancient world attributed to divine punishment, and he died by his own hand. And the Greeks lost another of their best men, this one not to the enemy, but to the kind of wound that no sword can inflict and no armor can prevent. More heroes arrived to take their places in the war. The Ethiopians sent their king, a man named Memnon, a son of the Dawn herself, a fighter of extraordinary quality, who killed many Greeks before Achilles' son Neoptolemus, newly arrived from home, brought him down. The Amazons came, warrior women from the east, led by their queen Penthesilea, and Achilles fought her and killed her, and when he saw her face in death, he felt something that troubled him, something he would have preferred not to have felt, and the ancient world told different stories about what that feeling was. The city of Troy was still standing. Its walls had held through 10 years, and all of this through the death of its greatest defender and the death of the enemy's greatest attacker, through plague and rage and grief and the interference of the gods. The walls had held, but holding was not the same as winning, and winning was not the same as surviving, and the Greeks were still on the beach, and the fleet was still in the harbor, and the question of how this was going to end was still open. The answer was being worked out in the mind of a man who was not a soldier in the traditional sense, who had never particularly wanted to be at this war, who had spent 10 years thinking about how to get home. Odysseus was thinking. He had been thinking for a long time, and the idea that was coming together in his mind was stranger and more audacious than anything that had yet been attempted. The night above the plain of Troy was very quiet. The fires on both sides burned low, and the men on both sides were tired in the deep way that comes from years of the same effort, the same fear, the same losses. The stars turned overhead. The sea moved against the beach, with the patient indifference it had always had. And in the camp of the Greeks, a man sat awake in the dark and thought and planned. The plan was Odysseus's, and it was so strange that when he first described it to the other Greek commanders, they were silent for a moment in the way that people are silent when they are not sure if what they have just heard is brilliant or ridiculous. It was, as it turned out, both. But mostly it was brilliant. The Greeks would build a horse, a very large horse, large enough to hold a group of soldiers inside its hollow wooden body. They would leave it on the beach as an offering to the gods, and they would sail away, or appear to sail away, taking the fleet over the horizon to the island of Tenedos nearby. The Trojans, who had watched the Greeks from their walls for 10 years and longed for them to leave, would come down to the beach and find the camp abandoned and the horse standing there, and the question of what to do with it would be put to them. They would be told by a man the Greeks left behind to play a particular role, that the horse was sacred, an offering to Athena, and that it had been made deliberately large so that the Trojans could not bring it inside their walls, because a prophecy said that if it entered Troy, the city would be unconquerable. If this seemed convenient, well, many things seemed convenient when people wanted them to be true. The man who volunteered to be left behind to sell this story was named Sinon, and what he did required a specific kind of courage that does not get celebrated in the same way as fighting bravely on the battlefield. He allowed himself to be captured by the Trojans. He told them a story about having been chosen as a sacrifice by the Greeks and escaping just before the fleet sailed. He played the role of a bitter, abandoned man who had no reason to protect the people who had tried to kill him. He was, in short, an extraordinary liar, and his lies were so well constructed, so full of the convincing details that true things have, that even the people who were suspicious of him could not quite find the fault line. There were voices in Troy that said, "Do not trust this." The prophet Cassandra, who had been cursed by Apollo to see the future truthfully and to never be believed, said not to bring the horse inside, said it clearly and with the desperate certainty of someone who has spent years watching their accurate predictions be ignored. A priest of Poseidon named Laocoon said the same thing in different words, with the practical suspicion of a man who has lived long enough to know that apparent good fortune in the middle of a war is not usually what it appears to be. Laocoon threw a spear at the horse's side, and those inside heard it strike and held their breath and did not move. And then, before the Trojans could think too carefully about what they were doing, 2 enormous sea serpents came out of the water and killed Laocoon and his sons, coiling around them on the beach in front of everyone. The Trojans, understandably, interpreted this as a sign that Laocoon had been wrong to mistrust the offering, that the gods themselves had punished him for his impiety, and that the correct thing to do was to bring the horse inside the walls immediately as an act of proper religious devotion. They brought the horse inside. They knocked down part of the wall to do it because it was too large for the gates, and they pulled it through the gap with ropes and effort and celebration, and the sound they made as they brought it in was the sound of people who believe they have won. The war was over. The Greeks had gone. After 10 years, after everything, it was finished. The city opened itself to a relief so enormous, it felt like the relief of every previous year of fear releasing at once, and the people of Troy allowed themselves something they had not allowed themselves in a very long time. They let their guard down. That night, Troy celebrated. They drank and ate and made offerings to the gods and felt the particular lightness of people from whom a great weight has been lifted. The wine went around and around, and the fires burned high, and the laughter was the specific kind of laughter that comes with survival, slightly too loud, slightly too intense, the laughter of people who are also crying somewhere under the surface. Old Priam sat in his hall and accepted the congratulations of his people and felt something that might have been relief, but was too fragile and too tentative to fully be called that. Andromache sat in the quiet rooms of the palace and felt nothing, or felt something that was not yet ready to be named. One by one the lights went out. One by one the celebrations quieted, and the people of Troy fell into the deepest, most unguarded sleep they had had in 10 years. The sleep of people who believe that the danger has finally passed. Inside the horse, the men waited. There was almost no room. They were folded around each other in the wooden darkness, sweating in the heat, breathing each other's breath, listening to the sounds outside as they moved through celebration towards silence. Odysseus was among them, and Neoptolemus, and Menelaus, and a number of others, men who had been chosen for their nerve as much as for their fighting skill, because what they were doing required the ability to stay absolutely still and absolutely quiet while everything in the body screamed. To move, Sinon, outside, gave the signal when the time was right, a torch raised at the appointed hour, to tell the fleet waiting beyond the horizon that it was time to come back. The sailors in the ships saw the light and began to row. Inside the horse, a door opened in the wooden belly, and the Greeks climbed down a rope to the ground, one after another, emerging into the silent city in the deep dark hours before dawn. They moved to the gates. They killed the sleeping guards with the quiet efficiency of men doing something that requires silence above everything else. They threw open the great gates of Troy from the inside. The fleet came ashore, and the soldiers poured through the gates in the darkness. And what began was the thing that the ancient world called the sack of a city. The fall of Troy happened in the darkest hours of the night, in the time between the middle of the night and the first suggestion of dawn, and the people inside the city had no warning and almost no time. They woke to fire and to the sound of men with weapons moving through their streets, and by the time they understood what was happening, there was very little they could do about it. Troy burned. The fires started in several places at once and spread through the narrow streets with the speed that fire has in places built close together, where the buildings share walls and the space between them is never quite enough. The light of it was visible from the sea, from a great distance, a red glow above the hill that had no natural explanation. It was the kind of light that people miles away could see and know without being told that something was over. Priam was killed in his own courtyard near the altar where he had gone to pray, where the tradition of the ancient world said a person should be safe from harm. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, found him there and killed him without ceremony, and the death of the old king was the final symbolic end of Troy, the ending of the long line of kings who had ruled that hill above the sea since anyone could remember. What Priam had feared most, what the prophets had told him, and what he had tried all his life to prevent, had come to pass in the most direct and unavoidable way. Andromache was taken prisoner. The Greeks gave Hector's wife to Neoptolemus, a final cruelty in a night full of them, and she went into captivity as the wife of the man whose father had killed her husband. The child Astyanax, Hector's small son, was killed by the Greeks, thrown from the walls of the city because the Greeks were afraid of what he might become when he grew up. Afraid of the son of Hector, and fear is the oldest explanation for the worst things that people do. Cassandra, who had been right about everything and believed by no one, was taken by Agamemnon as his prize. Ajax the Lesser, not the great Ajax who had already died, committed a sacrilege in the temple of Athena that the goddess would not forget, and the Greeks would pay for it on the voyage home. The sea turned against them by a god who balanced her books carefully, and over time, Helen was found. Menelaus had come for her with his sword already drawn, and what happened when he actually saw her is something the ancient sources describe differently, with varying amounts of sympathy for each of them. Some say he raised the sword and could not bring himself to use it. Some say she spoke, and what she said changed his mind. Some say that 10 years of war and loss and the long journey home ahead of him simply made the sword seem less important than it had when he first thought about this moment. She was taken aboard his ship, and they sailed together across the same sea she had crossed with Paris, going in the opposite direction now. Going home, the Greeks left. They carried with them the plunder of the richest city in the ancient world, the gold and the silver and the woven cloth and the carved ivories, and all the accumulated wealth of a city that had sat at the crossroads of 2 seas for 1,000 years and grown rich from the traffic. They put the women and the children on the ships as slaves. They pulled the walls down and broke what they could not carry, and burned what they could not break. As dawn came over the smoking ruins of Troy, the plain below was quiet in a way it had not been for 10 years. The bodies of the dead were everywhere, Greeks and Trojans, and the birds were already beginning to come to them in the way that birds have always attended the aftermath of human violence. The river Scamander moved past on its way to the sea, carrying the dust and the ash and the debris of what had happened into the water, where it would be dispersed and lost. There was nothing left of Troy that looked like a city. There were walls partly standing and walls entirely down. There were rooms open to the sky where roofs had been. There were the remains of fires in places where fires had no business being, in courtyards and in storage rooms, and in the corners of houses where families had tried to take shelter in the last hours. There was smoke still rising from what remained of the palace on the summit of the hill, and the smoke went up into a sky that was becoming, with indifferent persistence, a beautiful morning. The Greeks sailed. Their fleet spread out across the Aegean, and almost immediately, the gods who were angry with them began to demonstrate that anger. Storms came. Ships were separated from the main fleet. Some were wrecked. Some arrived home, only to find that home was not what they had left it. That 10 years of absence had changed things in ways that could not be changed back. Agamemnon came home to Mycenae and was killed by his wife Clytemnestra, who had never forgotten what had happened at Aulis, what he had done to their daughter in exchange for favorable winds. His homecoming lasted almost no time at all. Odysseus did not arrive home for another 10 years after the fall of Troy, kept wandering by the anger of the god Poseidon, passing through places that were at the edge of the known world and beyond it, meeting the dead and the half-divine and the monstrous, always moving but never quite arriving, until at last he came to Ithaca and found his wife Penelope faithful after 20 years of waiting, and his son Telemachus grown from a small boy into a young man, and his old dog, who had waited all that time and recognized him the moment he came through the door. The survivors of Troy scattered. Some went east, back into the depths of Asia, carrying their gods and their traditions and their memories into lands that would absorb them slowly over generations. Some were taken west as slaves and found their fates determined by the people who owned them. A tradition that the Romans told of themselves much later said that a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped the burning city with his father on his back and his son beside him and sailed west through the Mediterranean, and after many years and many wanderings arrived in Italy, and the people who came from him eventually built Rome. Whether this is history or story or some mixture of both is a question that has been debated for a very long time without being fully resolved. What is not debatable is what the fall of Troy meant in the imagination of the world that came after it. For thousands of years, people have told this story. Poets and dramatists and novelists have told it. Children have been taught it in schools. Archaeologists have dug in the ground of northwestern Turkey, looking for the real city beneath the story, and they have found layers of cities there, one built on top of another across thousands of years, and one of those layers shows signs of destruction by fire at roughly the right time, and the question of whether this is the Troy of the stories is one that no one can answer with complete certainty, and that uncertainty is perhaps part of the point. The story survived. That is what matters. It survived the fall of the city it describes, survived the collapse of the Greek world that told it first, survived the rise and fall of the Roman world that loved it and retold it, survived the long centuries of the medieval period and the Renaissance and the modern world, arrived here in the 21st century, still alive and still being told to people lying down in the dark, wanting to hear a story from a long time ago. Troy stood on its hill for 1,000 years. It fell in a single night, and the story of it has been going for 3,000 years since then, with no sign of stopping. That is the strange endurance of things that have been fully told. The city can fall. The walls can be pulled down. The fires can take everything that can be burned. But the story stays. It moves through time the way the sea moves around the edge of the world, in the old maps, constant and surrounding, always there even when you cannot see it. Let the ruins rest now under the quiet sky of the Troad. Let the grass grow back over the plain where the armies fought. Let the river find its way to the sea, as it always has, carrying what it carries, leaving behind what it leaves. Let the hill stand where it has always stood, above the water in the first light of morning. Troy has fallen, and the story goes on. And so the fires of Troy finally went quiet. The ships that had crossed the sea with such certainty and noise scattered back toward their different homes, carrying everything the war had made of the men who fought it. The city that had stood for 1,000 years became a story that would last for thousands more, told and retold in every language that the world has spoken since then. We traveled tonight through a world 3,000 years old. We stood on the walls of Troy with old Priam and watched the Greek fleet fill the sea with sails. We sat beside Achilles in his tent and felt the grief that only the loss of what is most beloved can produce. We heard the sounds of a city that believed the war was over, celebrating in the dark, not knowing what was waiting inside the horse on the plain. We watched the fires begin and the city fall, and the long, slow quiet that came after. These are human stories. They are old, and they are also not old at all, because the things they are made of, love and pride and grief and the desire to be remembered, do not change. People who lived 3,000 years ago felt the same weight of night, the same pull of sleep, the same need for a story to carry them into the dark. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small, quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently because of it. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play, and let the night continue, and let the ancient world keep talking in its old, slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The plain of Troy is quiet. The sea is dark and still. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when sleep finally comes and the body stops holding on to the day. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like a tide that always knows where it belongs. Like the sea below the hill at the end of a very long story. Sleep well and good night.